The Copa Room at the Sands Hotel was electric on that sweltering August night in 1963. Every table filled, every eye fixed on the stage where the impossible lived and breathed in a tuxedo. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and expectation, the kind of atmosphere that made legends feel immortal. Spotlights carved through the darkness, landing on Sammy Davis Jr., like a blessing from above. He was magic incarnate, the man who could tap dance faster than a machine gun and bend a note until it confessed your deepest secrets. The orchestra swelled behind him, that familiar arrangement wrapping around the room like silk. The audience leaned forward in their velvet booths, martini glasses paused halfway to lips, knowing they were about to witness something that would become part of Vegas folklore. This was Sammy in his element, the dynamo who had fought for every inch of that stage, who had turned his scars into spotlights and his pain into pure artistry. But perfection is a fragile thing. The music flowed, the rhythm pulsed, and Sammy opened his mouth to deliver the magic they'd all paid to see. Nothing came, not a note, not a word. The lyrics to a song he'd sung 1,000 times simply evaporated, leaving him standing in that white-hot spotlight like a statue of terror. The orchestra faltered, the conductor's baton frozen in mid-air. In the span of 5 heartbeats, the most confident man in show business became a monument to every performer's worst nightmare. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating. You could hear ice melting in highball glasses, hear the whisper of expensive fabric as 1,200 people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sammy's eyes darted left, then right, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The panic was naked and raw, the kind of vulnerability that could kill a career faster than any scandal. This wasn't just a forgotten lyric. This was the moment the magician dropped the rabbit, the moment the god bled in front of his worshippers. Backstage, Dean Martin had been leaning against a dressing room wall, halfway through a cigarette, not scheduled to appear for another 20 minutes. But Dean heard something the audience couldn't. The sound of a friend drowning in front of a crowd that had paid to see him walk on water. Earlier that evening, Sammy had shown Dean the death threat slipped under his dressing room door, another reminder that even in this glittering sanctuary, the world outside was watching, waiting for him to stumble. What happened next wasn't in any script. Dean stubbed out his cigarette, straightened his tie, and walked onto that stage without an introduction, without a plan, without anything except the instinct that told him his friend needed a lifeline. He moved with that distinctive, languid grace, a stroll that suggested the world could wait, and if it didn't, to hell with it. The audience didn't applaud. They were too confused. This wasn't supposed to happen. But Dean walked straight to Sammy, leaned into the microphone with that warm, bourbon-soaked voice, and asked, "You waiting for a bus?" The room exploded, not with polite laughter, but with relief so pure it was almost religious. Dean had done what Dean always did, made the impossible look effortless, turned disaster into legend, and saved his friend without ever letting anyone see the weight of what he'd just carried. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now let's go back to August 1963, inside the Copa Room at the Sands Hotel. In 1963, Sammy Davis Jr. stood at the intersection of impossible, wearing a crown that had begun to cut. He was the most electrifying performer in America, a man who could make a stage feel too small even when it was the size of a football field. The posters called him Mr. Show Business, but behind that dressing room door, he was carrying weight that would have crushed most men. He was the only black member of the Rat Pack, a position that meant he had to be flawless every single night. Not good, not great, flawless. Because the world was watching with different eyes, waiting for him to stumble, ready to use any mistake as proof that he didn't belong in that rarefied air with Frank and Dean. The personal toll was brutal and relentless. 3 shows a night, long rehearsals by day, studio sessions squeezed into whatever hours still existed. He was performing while the civil rights movement tore the country apart, expected to be both revolutionary and entertainer, to break barriers while never making white audiences uncomfortable. His marriage to Mae Britt, a white Swedish actress, had cost him everything he'd worked for with the Kennedy administration. He'd been scheduled to perform at the inaugural gala, the ultimate validation. Then, the marriage happened, and the invitation vanished like smoke. The message was clear. You can entertain us, but don't forget your place. While Frank and Dean charmed Camelot, Sammy stayed home, uninvited, reminded in the cruelest way that some doors were still locked from the inside. The hate mail arrived in stacks. Death threats became routine enough that he stopped mentioning them to friends. He had converted to Judaism, finding solace in a faith that understood persecution, but that choice, too, had cost him. More accusations that he was trying too hard, reaching too far, forgetting where he came from. The pressure to represent, to uplift, to never show weakness had become a vis slowly tightening around his chest. That August evening at the Sands, another piece of ugliness had been slipped under his dressing room door. The words were crude, specific, promising violence if he continued to push boundaries, to love who he loved, to stand where he stood. He'd shown it to Dean before the show, trying to laugh it off the way performers do, making darkness into comedy, because the alternative was paralysis. Dean had looked at the paper, then at Sammy, and said nothing. Just tore it into pieces, let them fall like confetti into a wastebasket, and said quietly, "They paid to hear you sing, kid. Not to hear from cowards." Dean Martin played the drunk, stumbling through songs with a rocks glass in hand, making it look like he'd rolled out of bed and onto the stage without a care in the world. The audience bought it completely. They had no idea that behind the lazy eyes was a man watching everything, protecting everyone, carrying his own quiet weight. He understood something fundamental about performance that Sammy was about to learn the hardest way possible. The mask you wear to survive can become the thing that suffocates you. As the house lights dimmed and the overture began, Sammy stood in the wings, his heart hammering against his ribs. He adjusted his cufflinks, flashed that $1,000,000 smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and stepped into the spotlight, completely unaware that in exactly 3 minutes, the very thing he trusted most would shatter in front of everyone. The first notes swept across the Copa room like they had 1,000 times before, the orchestra settling into that familiar groove with the confidence of musicians who knew they were about to witness magic. The brass section warmed the air. Drums whispered time like a lover's heartbeat, and every eye in the room fixed on the figure stepping into the spotlight. Sammy moved to center stage with that distinctive liquid grace, his silhouette cutting sharp against the burning white light. His tuxedo was perfect, his posture loose but ready, that impossible combination of coiled energy and complete ease that made other performers look like they were trying too hard. From the outside, this was Vegas perfection in motion. He lifted the microphone with the gesture of a man greeting an old friend, fingers wrapping around it like he was born holding it. The audience leaned forward as one living organism, 1,200 people suspended in that perfect moment before the magic began. Cigarettes paused halfway to lips, martini glasses froze in mid-sip, conversations died to whispers. They knew what was coming, because they'd heard this song on records, seen it on television, but they wanted it here, live, in this room where legends became immortal. The intro played exactly as it always did, every note falling into place like pieces of a puzzle completing themselves. Sammy drew breath, his chest expanding, ready to pour his soul into the opening line he had delivered countless times before. The moment arrived. He opened his mouth to sing. Nothing came out. Not a crack in his voice. Not a wrong word, not even a whisper. Just absolute, terrifying emptiness where the music should have been. It was as if someone had walked into his mind and switched off every light, leaving him standing in complete darkness while the world watched. His tongue felt heavy as lead, his throat tight as a fist. The connection between brain and mouth had simply severed, like a wire cut clean through. The orchestra kept playing for a beat, then two, waiting for the voice that never arrived. Panic hit his nervous system like ice water flooding his veins. His mouth went desert dry, palms instantly damp, and suddenly the spotlight that had always felt like a warm embrace became a harsh interrogation lamp, exposing every flaw, every tremor, every sign of the terror now coursing through him. Time stretched impossibly thin, each second feeling like an hour, each heartbeat thundering in his ears louder than the drums behind him. The breakdown spread through the orchestra like a virus. The conductor's baton wavered, his eyes darting between Sammy and the musicians, silently asking the question everyone was too stunned to voice. A trumpet missed its entrance. The piano faltered. One by one, the instruments began to drop out, the beautiful arrangement unraveling like a sweater with a pulled thread, until only the hum of amplifiers and the suffocating weight of silence remained. The audience's confusion was palpable, rippling through the room in waves of whispered questions and shifting bodies. 1,200 people who had come to worship at the altar of perfection were now witnessing something far more human and infinitely more dangerous: vulnerability. Their adoration began to curdle into pity, that soft, poisonous sympathy that kills careers faster than any scandal. They looked at their drinks, at their companions, anywhere but at the man disintegrating before their eyes. Sammy tried to force something, anything out of his throat. He managed a weak smile, a brittle laugh that sounded more like choking, but the words remained locked away. His mind, usually a steel trap for lyrics and timing and choreography, now felt like a room full of doors that had all slammed shut at once. Every burden he'd been carrying chose this moment to become unbearable: the death threats, the exhaustion, the crushing weight of having to be flawless just to be accepted. In the wings, Dean Martin watched with the practiced eye of someone who understood the difference between performance and survival. While the rest of the room saw a legend faltering, Dean saw something more fragile: a friend drowning in front of people who had paid to see him walk on water. The stage manager moved toward the curtain controls, ready to end the nightmare, but Dean was already straightening his tie, stepping out of the shadows toward the light. The conductor had his baton raised to cut the music, to mercifully end what was becoming a public execution, but Dean Martin was already moving. He didn't rush. That was the first miracle. In a business where panic spreads faster than wildfire, he strolled out of the wings with that signature, unhurried gait, a cigarette burning lazily between his fingers, a tumbler of amber liquid catching the stage lights. He moved like he was wandering into his own living room, as if crashing someone else's moment of terror was the most natural thing in the world. The audience's confusion deepened as this figure in an identical tuxedo materialized from the shadows. Dean wasn't scheduled to appear for another 20 minutes. There was no announcement, no fanfare, no dramatic entrance music. Just a man moving through space with the kind of ease that suggested gravity worked differently for him, that time itself might slow down if he asked it to. He walked past the frozen orchestra, past the terrified stage manager, straight into the center of the disaster where his friend stood trembling in the white hot spotlight. Dean stopped beside Sammy, took a slow drag from his cigarette, and exhaled a cloud of gray smoke into the burning air. The silence was so thick you could taste it, but Dean treated it like it was just a pause in a conversation he was having with himself. He leaned into the microphone, the feedback whining for a split second before his voice, warm and thick as molasses, filled the room with 5 words that would rewrite history. "You waitin' for a bus?" The tension didn't just break, it detonated. Laughter exploded from the darkness like a dam bursting, 1,200 people exhaling relief so pure it was almost religious. This wasn't polite society laughter. This was the guttural, desperate laughter of people who had just been pulled back from the edge of a cliff. In one perfectly timed line, Dean had performed psychological surgery, reframing the entire universe of that stage. Suddenly, Sammy standing there in silence wasn't a tragedy. It was the setup to a joke only Dean knew the punchline to. What followed was a masterclass in the art of salvation disguised as comedy. Dean didn't try to push Sammy back toward the lyrics that had abandoned him. Instead, he started to stumble. He slurred his words, feigned a loss of balance, grabbed onto Sammy's shoulder as if he were the one who needed support. It was a brilliant, selfless lie. By making himself the drunk, the fool, the chaotic element, Dean forced Sammy to become the steady one. He gave his friend a job to do: catch Dean. And in catching Dean, Sammy found his footing again. They fell into a rhythm that no writer could have scripted: verbal jazz with no safety net, two musicians trading solos in real time. Dean tossed up softballs for Sammy to hit out of the park, absorbing mockery so his friend could regain his power. The audience watched in awe as the terrified statue transformed back into the quick-witted dynamo they adored, his confidence returning with every laugh he wrung from the crowd at Dean's expense. The orchestra, reading the room with professional instinct, began to play soft background music, providing texture without overwhelming the miracle unfolding before them. Only those in the front row might have caught the moment Dean leaned in close, away from the microphone, under the cover of what looked like a clumsy, affectionate embrace. His eyes, usually heavy-lidded and distant, were razor-sharp and lucid as he whispered into Sammy's earwords meant for one man only: "I got you, Charlie. Just follow my lead." It was a promise kept in real time, a covenant sealed in the space between heartbeats, while 1,200 people watched without understanding what they were witnessing. By the time the orchestra kicked back in with a completely different song, the standing ovation had already begun. They weren't clapping for the music. They weren't even clapping for the performance. They were applauding because they had witnessed an act of love so profound it looked like comedy, a rescue mission disguised as a nightclub routine. The applause rose and stayed there, wave after wave of gratitude and wonder, washing over two men who had just turned disaster into legend through nothing more complicated than friendship. Dean straightened his tie, gave the audience that famous half-smile, and walked off stage as casually as he'd arrived, leaving Sammy to finish the show he'd come to do. The crisis was over. The legend was intact. But as the curtain finally fell and the roar of the crowd became a muffled memory, the real story was just beginning. In the narrow hallway leading to their dressing rooms, away from the lights and the applause, the masks would come off, and the true weight of what had just happened would settle between them like smoke in still air. The narrow corridor backstage felt like stepping into another world entirely, where the roar of 1,200 people became a muffled whisper through concrete walls, and the harsh reality of fluorescent bulbs replaced the forgiving glow of spotlights. Sammy walked these few yards like a man emerging from a fever dream, his bow tie already loosened, fingers working at shirt buttons with a desperate need to breathe again. The adrenaline that had carried him through the rest of the show was draining away, leaving behind the raw, shaking truth of what had almost destroyed everything he'd spent his life building. Dean was waiting in the dressing room doorway, jacket already off, sleeves rolled up, leaning against the frame like he'd been there for hours instead of minutes. There was no crowd of concerned managers, no clipboard-wielding agents dissecting the disaster. Just Dean, holding a glass of water, not whiskey, and wearing an expression that somehow managed to be both completely calm and fiercely protective. He didn't ask what happened, didn't probe or analyze or offer hollow reassurances about how it could have happened to anyone. He simply handed Sammy the water and said, "You hungry? Kitchen's probably still got those steaks we ordered." It was the unspoken code of men who understood that some wounds heal better when you don't keep examining them under harsh light. By refusing to treat Sammy like a victim of his own terror, Dean refused to let him become one, but beneath that casual exterior, a protective machinery was already grinding into motion with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been fighting other people's battles so long it had become instinct. While Sammy had been finishing his set, forcing his voice to work again, Dean had been working phones in the wings, building a fortress of protection around his friend before he even walked off stage. The first call had been to Frank, not to gossip about the stumble, but to quietly arrange for doubled security around the hotel. The second was to the stage manager, ensuring that no reporters would be allowed backstage that night, that the story leaving the building would be about the improvised comedy routine, not the moment of terror that preceded it. Dean moved through these conversations with the practiced ease of someone who understood that real power was exercised quietly, that the most important battles were won in hallways and back rooms where no cameras rolled. A lighting technician named Mickey Rourke, not the actor but a Vegas veteran who had worked every major room in town, would later describe what he witnessed that night in a 1987 interview with a trade publication. He had been coiling cables near the dressing rooms when he saw Dean corner a gossip columnist who was already crafting his story about Sammy's freeze. Dean, usually the most easygoing man in show business, had backed the man against a wall with nothing but the weight of his presence and a voice so quiet Mickey had to strain to hear it. "The man had a bad night," Dean had said, each word measured and final. "We all have bad nights. You write about anything except the laughs, and you'll find out how bad nights can get in this town." The columnist's story, published 3 days later, mentioned only the brilliant impromptu comedy routine that had the Copa room in stitches. This was the pattern that defined Dean Martin's life, a series of quiet stands taken in shadows where no one was keeping score. He was the star who refused to perform in venues that made his black friends enter through service doors. He was the actor who would quietly halt production if he saw extras being mistreated, not with dramatic confrontation but with a simple refusal to work until things were made right. He wielded his considerable power like a surgeon's scalpel rather than a sledgehammer, fixing broken things without ever asking for credit or recognition. Later that night, after they had shared those steaks and talked about everything except the one thing that mattered most, Dean slipped an envelope into the pocket of Sammy's coat hanging on the dressing room door. Inside was a personal check made out to May Britt for an amount that could have bought a house in the Hollywood Hills. The note attached was written in Dean's surprisingly elegant handwriting, brief and devoid of sentimentality. "Take him somewhere quiet for a few days. Don't tell him I sent this. Just get him some sun." Sammy would find that note 3 days later while packing for the impromptu vacation his wife had mysteriously insisted upon, and he would keep it in his wallet for the next 27 years, a piece of paper that weighed nothing but meant everything. The rescue on stage had been theater, a performance to save a performance, turning disaster into legend for the sake of 1,200 strangers who had paid to see magic. But this, the quiet protection that followed, the security arranged and schedules rearranged and checks written in darkness, this was the rescue that saved the man behind the legend. It was proof that in a city built entirely on beautiful illusions, one thing remained absolutely, unshakably real. When the spotlight went dark and the crowd went home, Dean Martin would still be standing there, making sure his friends never had to fall alone. The story of that night in the Copa room eventually hardened into the polished amber of Rat Pack mythology, preserved forever, but stripped of its original terror. Within months, entertainment columnists had transformed 5 seconds of paralyzing fear into a charming anecdote about two masters of their craft, turning disaster into comedy gold. The world chose to remember the punchline and forget the panic, because a legend stumbling is uncomfortable, but a legend cracking jokes is entertainment. What survived in the public imagination wasn't the silence, the moment a man almost broke under the weight of his own fame, but the bus line, the improvised routine, the effortless chemistry that made it look rehearsed. Sammy tried, in his quieter moments, to tell the complete story. In interviews throughout the late 60s and into the 70s, he would lean forward with intensity burning in his eyes, attempting to convey what Dean had actually saved him from that night. He would talk about the cold sweat, the way his mind emptied like someone had kicked over a bucket, how Dean didn't just make them laugh, but kept him from dying up there in front of 1,200 people. But the interviewers would inevitably steer him back toward the fun version, the sanitized mythology where everyone was drunk and happy and nothing ever hurt. They wanted the Rat Pack as cartoon, not as men. So the truth of Dean's intervention became a secret bond between them, stronger than any contract or blood oath. Their friendship evolved in the years that followed, moving away from the frantic energy of the strip and into quieter spaces. The late-night parties gave way to Sunday afternoon phone calls and dinners at Dean's house, where he would cook pasta and they would watch old westerns without feeling the need to entertain each other. The silence between them was no longer terrifying. It was comfortable, the easy quiet of two soldiers who had survived the same war. Then came the cruel mathematics of time. The death of Dean's son, Dean Paul, in that plane crash in March of 1987 shattered something essential in the King of Cool. The man who had been everyone's rock began to drift away into a grief so profound it looked like surrender. He retreated into his home, into silence, into a world where the pain couldn't reach him. And that's when the roles finally, inevitably reversed. Sammy, fighting his own battle with the throat cancer that would eventually claim his voice, became the protector. He was the one making the calls now, showing up at Dean's door not to party but simply to sit. When the Desperate Together Again tour was announced in 1988, Sammy agreed not for the money or the applause, but because he knew Dean shouldn't be out there alone. He watched Dean struggle with lyrics, saw the confusion that mirrored his own panic from decades before, and he stepped in, covering, guiding, making jokes to deflect from the memory lapses. In his final interview, when cancer had reduced his voice to a whisper, Sammy waved away questions about Frank, about the glamour, about the mythology. He wanted to talk about the man who had walked onto a stage when everyone else was looking away. "He saved me more times than I can count," Sammy rasped, and never once asked for credit. That's not show business, man. That's love. When Sammy died in 1990, the lights on the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed in his honor. But the most profound tribute happened away from the cameras, at the private funeral service. Dean Martin, now a ghost in his own life, walked up to the casket and stood there, for a long time, looking down at his friend, his brother, the man he had caught when the world tried to let him fall. He placed a hand on the polished wood, leaned in close like he was sharing one last secret backstage at the Sands, and whispered the same promise he'd made in the spotlight 27 years earlier. "I got you, Charlie. One more time." Then he straightened his tie with that old familiar gesture and walked away, carrying the truth of their love into the silence alone. Dean Martin built his entire existence on a lie so beautiful that even he sometimes believed it. The lie was effortlessness, the illusion that everything flowed through him like water finding its level, requiring no sweat, no strain, no visible cost. He made singing look like breathing and timing look like accident, stumbling through songs with a rocks glass filled with apple juice, playing the drunk so convincingly that people forgot they were watching one of the most disciplined performers in show business. He rehearsed endlessly in private so he could look unrehearsed in public, studied comedy with the precision of a surgeon so he could appear to be winging it. The mask wasn't just a character, it was a masterpiece of protective deception designed to make the hardest work in the world look like pure, careless magic. But every beautiful lie extracts its price, and Dean's cost him the one thing he gave so freely to others: permission to be human. He became everyone's safety net, the man who caught falling friends and made it look like gravity worked differently for him. He walked onto stages to save Sammy, wrote checks in darkness to save strangers, stopped productions to protect extras being mistreated, and did it all with that half smile that suggested he barely noticed the effort. The world saw generosity that looked effortless, but what they missed was the crushing loneliness of being the one person who could never ask for help, who could never show the cracks, who had to remain unshakable because everyone else was leaning on him. Being the person who makes everything look easy is its own kind of prison. When you're the one everyone calls to fix things, to smooth over disasters, to turn panic into punchlines, you don't get much space to fall apart yourself. Dean absorbed other people's fear like some kind of emotional sponge, folding their terror into his own until he was carrying weight that would have crushed ordinary men. There's a particular loneliness in that role, a slow erosion that doesn't show until something inside finally snaps under the pressure. Jerry Lewis, in a 2005 interview still raw with decades of unresolved pain, tried to explain what it was like to watch Dean carry that invisible burden. "He was the loneliest man I ever knew," Jerry said, his voice breaking, "because he made everyone feel safe and never let anyone return the favor. We all leaned on him, and he just kept standing there like it cost him nothing. But Jesus, it cost him everything. A lighting technician named Bobby Rosario, who worked the Vegas circuit for 40 years, remembered the night Dean quietly refused to take the stage until the black musicians in his band were granted the same hotel access as the white ones. He didn't make speeches, Bobby recalled decades later. He just sat in his dressing room, reading a newspaper, until management figured out what needed to happen. Then he got up, straightened his tie, and went out there like nothing had happened. The architecture of Dean's life was built on this impossible paradox. He saved others by letting them see his humanity, by playing the fool so they could be the straight man, by stumbling so they could catch him. But he never allowed himself the same grace. When his son Dean Paul died in that plane crash in 1987, the grief didn't just wound him, it revealed the fundamental impossibility of his existence. He had spent decades teaching people it was safe to fall because he would catch them, but he had never learned how to fall himself. So instead of breaking publicly, he simply withdrew, retreating into silence, because the alternative was admitting that the King of Cool was just a man who hurt like everyone else. Shirley MacLaine, who worked with Dean on multiple films and visited him in those final shadowed years, described finding a man who had disappeared into his own myth. "People think they knew Dean Martin," she said, shaking her head. "They knew a character he played so well he almost convinced himself it was real." The real Dean was what the Jewish people call a mensch, a deeply good man who felt the world's pain but could only express it through jokes. He was so much more fragile and so much braver than the drunk with a microphone. The greatest performance Dean Martin ever gave wasn't captured on any stage or screen. It happened in 1,000 private moments when he chose kindness over image, when he wrote checks no one knew about and made phone calls that saved careers, when he walked onto stages to catch falling friends and made it look like pure coincidence. These were the moments that defined him. The quiet heroism that happened when the cameras stopped rolling and the real man emerged from behind the tuxedo and the tumbler. When you strip away the mythology and the sanitized anecdotes, when you look past the drunk routine and the lazy smile, what remains is something far more profound than celebrity. What remains is a man who understood that the hardest thing in the world isn't hitting the right note, or getting the perfect laugh, or looking cool under pressure. The hardest thing is showing up for someone when they can't show up for themselves. Carrying them without letting them feel the weight. Saving them without making them feel saved. So let's return one final time to that sweltering August night in 1963, to the Copa Room, where smoke hung thick and dreams lived and died under burning spotlights. When Dean Martin stubbed out his cigarette and walked onto that stage, he wasn't rescuing a show or protecting a brand or maintaining the mythology of the Rat Pack. He was demonstrating something the world desperately needed to see, but rarely does, that strength isn't about never falling, it's about catching others when they do. That love isn't a spotlight emotion performed for applause, but a quiet choice made in the wings when no one's keeping score. In a business built entirely on beautiful illusions, Dean Martin's greatest trick was making heroism look like happenstance, turning salvation into a punchline, and proving that the coolest thing a man can do is be there when it matters, even if it costs him everything to make it look like it cost him nothing at all. When the lights finally dimmed and the crowd went home, that wasn't legend standing in the shadows. That was love, and love is the only thing that refuses to fade.